I never used to believe in fate until I heard Emma's story. It all started with a simple act of kindness. A decision made in the moment, one that seemed small at the time. She found a tiny, abandoned puppy on a cold night and took him in, thinking she was the one saving him. But what she didn't know was that one day, when she needed help the most, that same little dog would become her hero in a way no one could have expected. What happened when Emma was in danger? And how did this small, helpless stray return the favor in a way that left her in tears? Watch until the end to find out, and if you've ever had a pet show you incredible love and loyalty. Share your story in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more heartwarming stories. Emma gently rubbed her belly as she stepped onto the quiet sidewalk, her swollen feet protesting with each step. At 8 months pregnant, even short walks felt exhausting. But tonight, she needed fresh air. The nursery was finally complete, painted a soft shade of blue, with tiny stars scattered across the ceiling. Her husband, Daniel, had spent the entire weekend assembling the crib while she carefully folded tiny onesies into neat piles. Everything was ready, and yet, an unshakable restlessness settled deep in her chest. She loved feeling the baby move inside her, those little kicks reminding her that soon, she would be holding her son in her arms. But at the same time, the looming responsibility of motherhood overwhelmed her. Would she be a good mother? Would she know what to do when he cried? These thoughts swirled in her mind as she wandered through the neighborhood, hoping the crisp autumn air would clear her head. The streets were quiet, the golden leaves crunching beneath her shoes as a cool breeze rustled the trees. The glow of the streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, creating a peaceful yet slightly eerie atmosphere. Just as she was about to turn back home, a faint sound caught her attention. A whimper. Emma stopped in her tracks, straining to listen. At first, she thought she might be imagining it. But then, she heard it again, weak, high-pitched, and desperate. She glanced around. The houses were dark, their occupants already settled in for the night. The sound was coming from an alleyway a few feet ahead. Her heart pounded. Instinct told her it wasn't a good idea to wander into a dark alley alone, especially in her condition. But then the cry came again, more urgent this time, a helpless sound. Her maternal instincts took over, drowning out any hesitation. Carefully, she stepped toward the alley, the darkness swallowing her as she peered into the shadows. That's when she saw it. A tiny, trembling puppy curled against the cold concrete wall. Emma's breath caught in her throat. The little creature was barely more than skin and bones, its fur matted and dirty. It shivered violently, its tiny frame rising and falling with ragged breaths. Large, dark eyes stared up at her, filled with fear, but also a silent plea. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured, crouching down as best she could with her belly in the way. The puppy flinched at her movement but didn't try to run. Instead, it let out a soft, pitiful whimper. Emma's heart ached. She scanned the alley for any sign of its mother or siblings. But the place was empty, just cracked pavement, a few scattered trash bags, and the dim glow of a flickering streetlight. Someone must have abandoned it here, left it to fend for itself. She swallowed back a lump in her throat. How long had it been out here? Alone? How many people had walked past without stopping? Without thinking, she extended her hand slowly. The puppy hesitated, its small body tensing. Emma could feel it debating whether to trust her. "It's okay," she whispered. "I won't hurt you." After a long moment, the puppy gave in. It inched forward, pressing its cold nose against her fingers. Emma exhaled, a rush of relief washing over her. Gently, she scooped up the fragile creature, cradling it against her chest. The puppy barely weighed anything, its tiny ribs poking through its thin coat. It nestled against her warmth, too exhausted to resist. "You're so small," she murmured, stroking its dirty fur. "You must be starving." The puppy shivered but stayed in her arms, its little heartbeat fluttering against her. Emma felt something stir inside her, a fierce protectiveness, a sense of responsibility she hadn't expected. In that moment, she wasn't just a woman preparing to be a mother. She was already one. She straightened carefully, adjusting her hold on the puppy as she turned back toward home. Her baby kicked gently inside her belly, as if sensing the new life she was carrying. As she walked, she could feel the steady rhythm of the puppy's breath against her chest. Two heartbeats intertwined. She had saved a life tonight. What she didn't know was that, one day, this little creature would return the favor in a way that would leave her in tears. Toby had quickly become more than just a pet, he was Emma's shadow. Her tiny guardian. Ever since she had brought him home, he never left her side. Whether she was sitting on the couch, making tea in the kitchen, or folding baby clothes in the nursery, Toby was always right there, his bright eyes watching her every move. You really love your mommy, don't you? Daniel teased one evening, watching Toby rest his tiny head on Emma's lap. Emma laughed, stroking the little dog's soft fur. He knows I saved him, she said, smiling. But I think he's the one watching over me now. It was true. Toby had an uncanny sense of knowing when she was feeling tired or overwhelmed. If she sighed or rubbed her aching back, he would nuzzle against her, as if offering comfort. Some nights, when she struggled to sleep, Toby would curl up beside her belly, resting his warm body against her. She liked to think that he was already bonding with the baby. That somehow, he understood a new life was coming. Daniel had never been much of a dog person before, but even he couldn't deny Toby's devotion. I think he's taken his job as your protector very seriously, he joked. Emma just smiled. She had no idea just how true those words would turn out to be. It was a quiet afternoon, and the house was unusually still. Emma sat on the couch, cradling a warm cup of chamomile tea in her hands. The nursery was completely ready now, tiny clothes neatly arranged. Diapers stocked, a soft rocking chair sitting in the corner. Waiting for sleepless nights, she felt at peace, but also exhausted. Being 8 months pregnant was no small task. Her feet ached constantly, and even the simplest activities left her breathless. Toby lay curled up beside her, his small body rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. She reached down absent-mindedly and stroked his ears. I think we both need a nap. Huh? She murmured. She closed her eyes, letting herself drift into the edge of sleep. Then, without warning, a sharp, searing pain shot through her belly. Emma gasped, her body stiffening as the cup slipped from her hands. Crashing onto the floor, the hot liquid splashed across the hardwood. But she barely noticed. Her hands flew to her stomach. The pain was unlike anything she had felt before, intense, crushing, making it impossible to breathe. She tried to sit up, but dizziness overtook her, making the room spin violently. Her vision blurred. Her body felt like it was shutting down. Toby, she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. The little dog's head snapped up instantly. His ears perked, and his bright eyes widened in alarm. He let out a soft, uncertain whimper before nudging her arm. Emma's breath was coming in ragged gasps now. She tried to reach for her phone on the coffee table, but her fingers were weak, trembling too much to grip anything. Before she could even touch it, another wave of pain crashed over her, and her body went limp. Her mind was slipping. The last thing she saw was Toby's small, frantic face before everything faded into darkness. Toby barked, once, twice. When Emma didn't respond, his small body tensed with panic. He jumped up onto her lap, nudging her face with his nose, licking her cheek desperately. She didn't move. His heart pounded. Something was very, very wrong. Toby jumped down, pacing in circles, his little paws tapping frantically against the floor. He let out another sharp bark. But still, Emma didn't wake up. He needed help. Without hesitation, Toby bolted toward the front door. He stood on his hind legs, scratching at the wood, barking as loudly as his small body would allow. When the door didn't budge, he ran to the window, hopping up onto the couch and pressing his nose against the glass. Outside, their neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, was watering her garden. The elderly woman had always liked Toby, often offering him treats over the fence when she saw him in the yard. She was just about to head back inside when she heard the barking. It was different this time, urgent, desperate. Frowning, she turned toward Emma's house. Through the window, she spotted Toby, jumping and pawing at the glass frantically. Something wasn't right. She walked closer, cupping her hands around her eyes to get a better look. That's when she saw Emma, slumped on the couch, motionless. Panic shot through her veins. She rushed to the front door and knocked loudly. Emma, are you all right? No response. Toby barked even louder. his tiny body practically vibrating with desperation. Mrs. Thompson's hands trembled as she reached for her phone and quickly dialed Daniel's number. "Daniel, it's your neighbor. Margaret, something's wrong with Emma, she's inside. But she's not moving." Daniel had never driven faster in his life. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His heart pounded against his ribs. His mind filled with terrifying possibilities. Emma, his wife, his unborn child. When he finally screeched into the driveway, he barely remembered shutting off the car before sprinting toward the house. Mrs. Thompson was waiting at the door. "I called an ambulance," she said, her voice shaking. "It's on the way." Daniel barely heard her. He pushed open the door and rushed inside. His breath caught in his throat when he saw Emma, pale, unmoving, her face twisted in pain. He fell to his knees beside her. "Emma, sweetheart, wake up." His hands shook as he touched her face, brushing her hair back. A weak groan. Her eyelids fluttered slightly, but she couldn't speak. Daniel felt tears sting his eyes. He turned to Toby, who stood beside them, his tail still, his body tense. "You got help," Daniel whispered, his voice breaking. "You saved her." Toby let out a soft whimper, his eyes full of worry. Moments later, the wail of sirens filled the air. Paramedics rushed in, lifting Emma onto a stretcher. Daniel held her hand the entire way to the hospital, whispering reassurances even as his own fear threatened to consume him. Hours passed before the doctor finally approached Daniel in the waiting room. "She's stable," he said, offering a reassuring smile. It was a sudden drop in blood pressure, likely due to exhaustion and stress. "We've given her fluids, and she just needs rest. The baby is doing fine." Daniel sagged with relief. His entire body felt weak, as if he had been holding his breath for hours. When he was finally allowed into her room, Emma was awake, her eyes heavy with exhaustion but full of warmth. He sat beside her, taking her hand. "You scared me," he murmured. Emma smiled weakly. "I think I scared myself." Then, as if remembering something, she looked around. "Where's Toby?" A soft whimper came from the foot of the bed. Emma turned her head, and there he was, sitting patiently, his little body still, his big, brown eyes watching her carefully. Tears welled in her eyes as she reached out a trembling hand. "Come here, baby." Toby didn't hesitate. He jumped up onto the bed, curling up beside her, pressing his warm body against her side. Emma let out a soft laugh, wiping at her eyes. "You saved me," she whispered. "My little hero." Toby wagged his tail, his job complete. She had saved him once. Now, he had saved her right back. The night at the hospital had been long, but Emma finally felt at ease. She lay in bed, her body exhausted but her heart full. Every now and then, she ran her fingers through Toby's fur as he rested beside her. He hadn't left her side since the moment Daniel had brought him to the hospital. Daniel sat in the chair next to her, his hand resting over hers. His eyes were still filled with worry, but relief softened his features. "I still can't believe it," he murmured. Toby knew something was wrong. He got help. Emma smiled weakly, glancing down at the little dog curled up beside her. "He didn't just get help. He saved my life." Daniel reached out to scratch behind Toby's ears. The dog's tail wagged slightly, but his eyes remained fixed on Emma, as if he was still on high alert. "The doctors said if you had been alone much longer." Daniel trailed off, shaking his head. "I don't even want to think about it." Emma squeezed his hand gently. "But I wasn't alone," she said softly. "Toby was with me." The next day, Emma was discharged from the hospital. The doctors had assured her that she was stable, but she needed to rest as much as possible. Daniel helped her into the car carefully, making sure she was comfortable before driving them home. As soon as they pulled into the driveway, Toby perked up. His tiny body vibrated with excitement as Daniel opened the door. The moment they stepped inside, Toby ran ahead, checking each room as if making sure everything was safe for Emma's return. Emma chuckled. "I think he's making sure our home is still in one piece." Daniel shook his head in amusement. "I think he's making sure you're safe." Toby finally returned, hopping onto the couch beside Emma as she sat down carefully. He curled up against her belly, resting his head on her lap. Emma stroked his fur, her heart swelling with gratitude. "You really are my little guardian angel, aren't you?" Toby let out a soft huff, nuzzling against her. From that moment on, Emma knew there was nothing she wouldn't do for him. A month later, the day finally arrived. Emma's contractions started early in the morning, and within hours, she was in the hospital, gripping Daniel's hand as waves of pain racked her body. Toby had been left with Mrs. Thompson, but even as they drove away, he had stood at the window, watching them go with wide, worried eyes. After hours of labor, their son, Noah, was born. The first time Emma held him in her arms, tears filled her eyes. He was perfect, tiny fingers curled into fists, his skin warm and soft against hers. Daniel sat beside her, his own eyes glassy with emotion. "He's beautiful," Daniel whispered. Emma pressed a soft kiss to Noah's forehead. "He's everything." When they finally brought Noah home, Toby was waiting at the door. The moment Daniel opened it, the little dog bolted inside, his nose sniffing wildly. Emma sat down carefully on the couch, cradling Noah in her arms. "Toby," she called softly. Toby's ears perked up. He hesitated for a moment, his tail wagging slightly as he approached, sniffing the air. Daniel knelt beside him. "This is your baby brother, buddy." Toby crept closer, his tiny paws stepping lightly. He sniffed Noah's blanket, then his little fingers. His ears twitched as he listened to the quiet coos coming from the newborn. Then, as if understanding, Toby gently licked Noah's hand before curling up beside Emma, pressing his body close to both mother and child. Emma let out a soft laugh, tears stinging her eyes. "He already loves him." Daniel wrapped an arm around her. "Of course, he does. He's been protecting him since before he was even born." From that day forward, Toby took his role as Noah's protector seriously. Whenever Noah cried, Toby would rush to Emma's side, nudging her with urgency. When Noah was placed in his crib, Toby would lie beside it, standing guard. And as the months passed, as Noah grew and learned to crawl, Toby was always nearby, patiently letting the baby grab onto his fur, never once complaining. One evening, as Emma rocked Noah to sleep, she glanced down at Toby, who lay curled up at her feet. She thought back to that cold, dark night in the alley when she had found him, small, weak, and abandoned. Back then, she had thought she was saving him. But now, she knew the truth. Toby had saved her, again and again. With a warm smile, she reached down, stroking his fur. Toby lifted his head, looking up at her with those same soulful eyes he had given her the very first day they met. "Thank you," she whispered. Toby wagged his tail, then nestled back down, letting out a content sigh. He wasn't just a pet, he was family. What do you think about today's story? Do you believe situations like this can happen in real life? If you have any thoughts or feedback, feel free to leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any exciting stories. See you in the next video.